Since Seiko made the NH34 available on the market, having a GMT in your lineup as a micro brand became a staple. It feels like you're being left behind if you don't keep up with the times, no pun intended. So since late 2022, microbrands started competing for the title of the best GMT under $500. We all know that such watch does not exist, because if it did, I wouldn't have as many watches in my watch box as I have socks in my socks drawer. That's a weird analogy, but you know where I'm going with this. But leaving socks behind and getting back to watches, if we go back 8 months, Borealis was one of the first micro brands that have a model with this movement. If you're not familiar with Borealis, again, I don't know what's wrong with you, but for context, they have been in business since 2013, which makes them a year older than Zelos, and they're still going very strong. Their models are a mixture of homage watches and original designs with a lot of bang for your buck. Today we're going to take a look at their Sea Storm GMT Mk2, and in case you didn't figure out by now, this was released about 8 months ago or thereabouts. And like the other models, it takes inspiration from new watches, but as contradictory as this may sound, it's a very original design. To translate that, it does some things very well, and some things leave you scratching your head. But as we say in Ireland, sure, look, you can't please everyone. Before we get into the nitty-gritty and start taking this thing apart, I would really like for you to consider subscribing to my channel if you like my style of content, or this type of content, or whatever it says, because I really want to grow this little channel. So click that subscribe button down below. Now let's get into it. So let's get the dimensions out of the way. This is where the weird things start. We have a case diameter of exactly 41.5 millimeters, lug to lug of 48.8, a lug width of 20 millimeters, a thickness of 14.4, and a weight of 157 grams, size up to my 6.3 inch wrist. So let's dig a little deeper. How does this wear? Like a 14.4 millimeter thick watch. I mean, it looks tall on my wrist no matter how you look at it. 14.4 millimeters is tall and thick for every watch. And I think it looks and feels like this due to the fact that it has 20 millimeter lugs. So let's just put it in perspective. It's like a big bodybuilder with a big upper body but skipped leg day. It's a weird analogy, but I hope that makes sense. For the thickness, the diameter is just right. 41.5 works, but this would sit much better on the wrist with 22 millimeter lugs. The female end links hug the wrist beautifully, but it's a little bit too tall still. Put all of this together and you have the occasional wobble if you like to wear your watches a little bit loose. Oh, also, I didn't mention this because we weren't on that chapter yet, but the thickness I think is also related to the fact that this is a 300 meter water resistant watch, which is a perfect segue for the next part, the case. It's very well finished, fine brushing pretty much everywhere, with a few chamfered edges here on the side just to break the lines a little bit visually and for that kind of separation. We have screw down crown at the 3 with the Borealis logo that aids with the water resistance, which I will elaborate on in a bit. No more ranting, I promise. And this is also paired with a screw down case back that has a mermaid engraved. Now, I'm not big into case back engravings, but this is actually cute. And lastly, we're on the case. We have the bezel, 120 clicks with a texture grip just on the upper part with a Lume GMT sapphire insert. That was a long one. Now, my main points of attention on the case. This has a very solid feel and it is very well machined, which translates into the weight overall. So this is a definite bonus. The 300 meter water resistance. Now this ties into my earlier point with the overall thickness. This much water resistance is actually unnecessary with the design and the 20 millimeter lugs. You could have the same effect with a 200 meter water resistance rating with a thinner case, Or if you want to keep the case and the water resistance, have the 22mm lugs and just have a little bit more balance on the wrist. I'll leave that confusion with all those measurements with you. And my last point, the bezel and the bezel insert. The clicks are not perfect. They're a bit loud, but then again, it aligns and it does, for me, it's just perfectly livable. To that, as much as people like to say that they use their bezels as a fidgety toy, I think that's just snobby talk to complain about the noise on a bezel. So I think just forget about it. I don't want to hear it. Let's just carry on. Let's talk about the dial now. It's very simple in nature. I have the black version covered by a flat piece of double dome sapphire crystal with AR on the inside. Now, no problem with the visibility, no matter whatever viewing angles you have. The layout is super straightforward. Everything is printed in white and perfectly legible. In terms of writing, very minimal, and I like that. Borealis at the 12 and 30 atmospheres and automatic at the 6. Sword style hands with a red GMT hand. You can just have a glance at this and you'd be able to know exactly where everything is. Not a whole lot to elaborate on here, but there are a few comments which are more like constructive criticism, if you like. Starting with the date, which I didn't mention. I love to have a date function on my watches, and in this case, we do have a date. Brilliant, but we have a black date wheel and this does get a bit lost. I do appreciate that feature, but it takes me a little while to find it. And on the other hand, I know I would have complained if I didn't have it, so I'm totally fine with this, as confusing as that may sound. I'd rather know that it's there and just spend the time to look at it. And the second thing is the overall size of the dial. If you just keep the watch a bit further away from your face, the dial just looks very, very small in comparison to the watch, especially when I tell you that this is a 41.5mm case size. It's just the overall visual effect. I think it's a combination of thickness and big numerals that make it feel a bit crowded and give it that small effect that I was mentioning. And to top it all off, we have the Lume BW9 and heaps of it. This thing glows and the bezel insert and the numerals on the dial really stand out. This is perfectly usable, and by perfectly usable, I mean in case you go to the toilet at night for a pee and you need to check the time, you can see it. It's super crisp and very well applied. For the first time on the channel, let's talk about the NH34 movement powering this. So this is what they call a collar GMT, not a true GMT, but I guess you already knew that since this has been covered on YouTube quite a bit now. Not much difference between this and the NH35 apart from the obvious in terms of specs. It hacks and it hand winds, and I think this from the factory has stated tolerances of -25 to +35 seconds per day. My example runs at -2 seconds per day. I don't know if Borealis tinker with this before shipping it, but whatever they do with it, I hope they do this to all the other watches, and I hope it runs the same as mine does. Last but not least, as usual, let's talk about the bracelet. It's decent female end links, which it's always nice to see. 3-link, but I can't really tell you exactly what kind of style it is. It tapers from 20 down to 18 at the clasp, which by the way is milled with 4 holes of micro adjustments. Screw pins to adjust and you'll get a near perfect fit since the links are small and you have 5 micro adjusts. Now this for me was a breeze to size, and the screws are very well machined. I did have to check if all the screws were screwed in properly or if they were loose, but that's just something that I do with all the watches, and some of them were, but this is not the end of the world because I think for me personally, this is an exercise that I would recommend to everyone. So in terms of bracelet, my comments here are not specifically on the quality, but again, I keep saying on the size chosen. Like I said at the beginning, a watch with this thickness deserves a 22mm lug or sized lugs, but maybe this is just me. So this is just my opinion, because again, I still think it sits too tall on the wrist. So my final thoughts here. Honestly, this leaves me scratching my head a bit, and not in a normal way, like, I mean, in an unnatural way, like I would at least expect it, like putting your hand like that. Partly because I think this is how this watch was designed. For example, there is nothing wrong with the thickness, but did it really need to be this thick? Did it really need to be 300 meter water resistant? See what I'm coming from? Now, did the bezel need to be that thick? Again, there's nothing wrong with it, but did it really need to be that thick or that tall? And you ask these questions with the head kind of like tilted on the side. Me personally, I like a quirky watch. I wore this when I was working on my car, and not a single care in the world was you know what I mean, was given. This can definitely take the abuse you throw at it. And again, because it's the thickness and it's the size that it is. And to round all this up, I actually am glad that Borealis is still in business. And please, keep doing what you're doing. You're doing something right, and I do appreciate it. So, that was it for me, guys. I hope you enjoyed my review of the Borealis Seastorm GMT Mk2. Please leave me a comment down below what you think about the watch, what you think about Borealis in general. Click like, subscribe to the channel as usual, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks again. Bye.